What I'm about to share is something most people misunderstand about intimacy, connection, and what actually happens behind closed doors in relationships. Because it's rarely about performance and almost never about technique. It's about psychology, presence, and emotional safety. Let me take you back for a moment. I was sitting in a quiet coffee shop a few years ago, just observing people, as I often do when studying human behavior. At the next table, two women were talking, not loudly, but enough that I could clearly catch the conversation. One of them was clearly frustrated about her relationship. She leaned in and said something that immediately paused my attention. She said, "He thinks he's amazing because he can lift me up against the wall, but I just want him to hold me still on the bed for 5 minutes. Why is that so hard?" There was a silence after that. Then her friend responded calmly, almost like she already understood the answer. Because stillness is scarier for them. Movement is easy. Looking you in the eyes, that's the hard part. That sentence stayed with me because it reveals something most people never talk about openly. In many relationships, physical intensity is not the problem, emotional presence is. There is a quote in psychology that often explains this dynamic very well. The body speaks what words cannot. And in intimacy, that becomes even more true. Many women are not asking for complexity. They are not asking for performance or acrobatics. They are asking for presence, for stillness, for connection that feels real and grounded. And interestingly, most of these experiences don't require advanced technique at all. They require something much harder for many people: attention, awareness, and emotional availability. Today, I want to break down something that is rarely discussed in a clear, honest way. 5 positions that many women naturally gravitate toward, but men often misunderstand or overlook. And I want to be very clear here. This is not just about physical positioning. This is about psychology, attachment, and emotional expression through the body. Let's begin with one of the most intimate and misunderstood ones: the lotus position. On the surface, it looks simple, but its emotional impact is far deeper than it appears. In this position, the man sits comfortably, often cross-legged or in a stable seated posture. The woman sits on his lap, wrapping her legs around his waist. They are face to face, chest to chest. Very little physical distance between them. And that is exactly where the psychology begins. There is no separation here, no distraction, no turning away, only direct presence. The movement in this position is not about force or intensity. It is about rhythm. A slow, natural, almost circular motion that requires both individuals to stay grounded. The man cannot rush here, and if he tries, the balance breaks. So the body naturally forces something important: slowness, breathing, synchronization. For many women, this is the real appeal. Because when she wraps herself around him, there is a moment of complete vulnerability. Her face is close to his. He can see every micro expression, every shift in emotion, every subtle reaction. But more importantly, she can see his presence too: his eyes, his focus, his stillness. Many men avoid this without realizing it, not because it is difficult physically, but because it demands emotional stillness. And stillness can feel uncomfortable when someone is used to constant movement or control. But from a psychological perspective, something very important happens here. When a woman is held like this, she is not just physically supported, she is emotionally anchored. She feels his breath. She feels his attention. She feels the lack of distance. And that creates a sense of safety that goes beyond physical touch. This is why, for many women, the lotus position is not about intensity at all. It is about being held in a way that feels emotionally present and unhurried. Now let's move into something that appears simple, but carries a very deep psychological meaning: spooning. At first glance, people often misunderstand this. They think of it as something casual or secondary, something that happens when energy is low. But that interpretation misses the real point entirely. In spooning, the man lies behind the woman, curved around her body. His chest aligns with her back. His arm rests gently around her waist. There is contact at multiple points of the body, continuous and steady. She is the little spoon, he is the big spoon. And that structure matters psychologically because it creates a sense of enclosure, of being surrounded, of being held without needing to perform or respond. For many women, this is one of the few positions where they do not feel the need to present themselves in any way. There is no eye contact pressure, no expectation of expression, no performance, just being. And that is often what is missing in modern relationships: a space where a person can simply exist without effort. From a psychological standpoint, spooning also introduces trust in a very subtle way. Because the woman is facing away, she cannot fully see the man. She is relying on his presence behind her, his stability, his consistency. That creates a very specific kind of emotional reliance, not fear, but surrender. And when done with genuine presence, it communicates something very powerful. I am here. You don't need to hold yourself together right now. That is where we will continue next. Because what comes after this builds even deeper layers of emotional dynamics and connection. Now let's move into the chair position, which is often misunderstood because on the surface, it looks like it is centered around control. But in reality, it is more about stability, visibility, and emotional balance between two people. In this setup, the man is seated on a firm chair. It can be a dining chair, a sturdy seat, or the edge of a bed where posture remains stable. His feet are placed flat on the ground. His body is grounded, unmoving. Then the woman sits on his lap, facing him, wrapping her legs around his waist. At first glance, many assume this is a position where the woman is doing all the work. But that is a very surface level interpretation, because the real foundation of this position is not movement, it is support. The man becomes the anchor, completely still, fully present. And the woman becomes the expression of movement, but only because she feels secure enough to do so. This is where the psychology becomes interesting. When a woman is in this upright position, she is not collapsed forward. She is not physically straining to hold herself up like in many other positions. Instead, she is vertical, balanced, visible. And that changes everything. Because now eye contact becomes direct and uninterrupted. There is no hiding, no turning away, no avoidance. She is seen fully, and she can see him fully in return. For many women, this visibility creates a powerful emotional response, not because of dominance or control in a traditional sense, but because of acknowledgement. She is not being ignored. She is not being rushed. She is being observed with attention. And that feeling alone can be deeply validating. At the same time, the man is not passive here. Even though he is seated, his role is extremely important. He is providing stability. He is regulating pace. He is offering a grounded base that allows her to move freely without fear of imbalance. And that is a form of participation that is often underestimated, because in many cases, emotional engagement is not about constant motion. It is about consistency. Now, there is another layer here that many people overlook. This position also allows the woman to express control over rhythm and movement in a way that feels natural rather than forced. She can lean back slightly. She can lean forward again. She can adjust her posture without losing stability. And this creates a rare dynamic. She is leading the motion, but not carrying the weight alone. That balance is what makes this position psychologically meaningful, because it creates what many would describe as shared control. Not one person dominating the experience, not one person completely passive, but a synchronized interaction. The man provides structure, the woman provides expression, and together they create rhythm without confusion or struggle. From an emotional standpoint, this also gives the woman space to feel seen in a different way. She is not lying down. She is not hidden. She is upright, present, visible, and that visibility often translates into emotional confidence. Now let's transition into another position that carries a very different psychological meaning, even though it is often thought of in purely physical terms: legs on shoulders. This position is frequently misunderstood because people tend to focus only on its physical intensity, but its emotional structure is actually far more complex. Here, the woman lies on her back. The man lifts her legs and places them over his shoulders. Her body becomes open, fully extended, unrestricted. And from a physical standpoint, yes, this does create deeper physical closeness. But the emotional meaning goes beyond that, because what happens psychologically when the body is fully open is a sense of exposure. There is no turning away, no covering, no protective closure. Everything is visible. And that level of exposure requires trust, not just physical comfort, but emotional assurance that she is safe in that state. For many women, this is not about intensity. It is about surrender in a controlled environment, where vulnerability is met with attention rather than detachment. The man's role here is also very specific. He is not just engaging physically. He is supporting her structure, holding her legs, maintaining balance, controlling depth and distance through positioning rather than force. And that creates an important psychological message. I am in control of your safety while you are in a vulnerable state. That message is often more important than the physical aspect itself, because vulnerability without safety creates discomfort. But vulnerability with stability creates trust. There is also something very important about eye contact in this position, because the angle often brings faces closer together in a way that forces awareness. There is no distraction, no separation, no distance to hide behind, just direct presence. And for many women, that is where emotional intensity actually comes from, not from movement, but from being seen while completely open and unguarded. This is also where many men either misunderstand or underestimate the experience. They focus on performance or physical strength. But the real requirement here is attention, constant awareness, reading subtle reactions, adjusting naturally. Because in this position, communication becomes nonverbal. Breath changes, facial expressions, small shifts in posture, all of it matters. And when a man responds to those signals properly, the experience becomes emotionally grounded rather than purely physical. When a woman seeks this position, she is not simply seeking intensity. She is seeking confirmation that her vulnerability will be handled with care, that she can open up completely without being emotionally dismissed or physically ignored. And that is where we will continue in the next section, where the psychological layer becomes even more centered on surrender perception and emotional reciprocity. Now we move into a position that is often seen in a very narrow way, but in reality carries a much deeper psychological meaning than most people realize. This is the seated oral position. At first description, it sounds simple, almost mechanical in how it is set up. The woman sits at the edge of a bed or on a stable chair. She leans back slightly for comfort and balance. The man kneels down in front of her. That is the basic structure, but the meaning behind it is where things become much more complex, because this position is not just about physical arrangement. It is about hierarchy, attention, and emotional perception. Now, many men instinctively avoid this position without even thinking about it, not because they lack interest, but because of what kneeling represents psychologically. In many cultures and internal belief systems, kneeling can feel like lowering oneself, like stepping into a submissive role, like giving up control or status. And because of that internal resistance, this position is often overlooked. But from a completely different perspective, the emotional interpretation is not about lowering oneself at all. It is about elevating the other person. Because what actually happens here is very specific. The man shifts all focus toward her experience, her comfort, her sensations, her presence. He removes distractions, he removes distance. He removes ego-driven positioning, and instead, he places himself in a role of complete attention. That alone changes the entire emotional dynamic. For the woman, this creates a very distinct experience. She is seated, relaxed, supported. She does not need to perform physically. She does not need to adjust her posture constantly. She does not need to manage the interaction. She is simply receiving. And that receiving state is often overlooked in discussions about intimacy. Because in many relationships, both people are unconsciously performing, adjusting, reacting, managing how they are perceived. But here, that pressure is reduced significantly. There is also a strong visual dynamic at play. From her perspective, she looks down and sees him fully focused on her, not distracted, not distant, not emotionally absent, but completely engaged. That visual alone can have a strong psychological impact, because being the center of someone's attention in such an undiluted way creates a feeling of being valued, not just physically, but emotionally prioritized. And that is where the deeper meaning of this position lies. Now, from his side, this requires a different kind of discipline, not physical effort in the traditional sense, but mental focus, because kneeling changes posture, yes. But more importantly, it changes mindset. It requires patience, consistency, and sustained attention to subtle feedback. Small reactions matter here. Shifts in breathing, changes in body language, micro expressions that indicate comfort or adjustment. Because the entire experience is built on responsiveness rather than force. And that responsiveness is what makes the dynamic feel emotionally connected rather than mechanical. For many women, this position creates something very specific psychologically. It is not just pleasure, it is not just physical satisfaction. It is the feeling of being prioritized without negotiation, of not having to ask for attention, of not having to compete for presence. She is simply receiving it, fully. And that can feel deeply affirming in a way that goes beyond physical interaction. Now we transition into something even more emotionally layered. A position that combines vulnerability, exposure, and trust in a very direct way. Legs on shoulders. At first glance, this position is often described only in physical terms. But psychologically, it carries a much heavier emotional structure. Here, the woman lies on her back. The man gently lifts her legs and places them over his shoulders. Her body is opened up completely, not in a chaotic way, but in a controlled, supported way. And that distinction is extremely important because openness without support creates discomfort. But openness with stability creates trust. In this position, the woman is physically exposed. There is no turning away, no protective posture, no closed body language. Everything is visible. And that visibility requires confidence in the person in front of her. Not just confidence in their strength, but confidence in their emotional steadiness. The man's role here is very specific. He is not only engaging physically, he is supporting her structure, holding her legs, maintaining alignment, adjusting pressure and position naturally. And through that, he communicates something without words. I am steady. I am attentive. You are safe in this state. That message is central to the entire experience. Because vulnerability without reassurance feels unstable, but vulnerability with grounded presence feels safe. There is also a strong visual connection in this position, because the angles naturally bring faces closer in a direct line of sight. There is very little separation, very little distraction, just direct awareness of each other. And that kind of visual proximity intensifies emotional perception, not because of intensity alone, but because of exposure combined with attention. The woman is not hidden, the man is not distant. Both are fully present in the moment. And in many cases, that is what creates emotional depth here, not complexity, not performance, but presence under vulnerability. When a woman seeks this position, she is often not just seeking physical sensation. She is seeking reassurance that she can be fully open without judgment or emotional withdrawal, that her vulnerability will be met with stability. And that is where we will continue in the next part, where we move into the final layer of this psychological breakdown, and the dynamic of surrender, devotion, and emotional reciprocity becomes even more pronounced. Now we move into one of the most psychologically misunderstood positions, where the surface description hides a much deeper emotional structure underneath. This is the idea of movement from a supported seated position, often described as the chair dynamic in intimacy discussions, but the real meaning goes far beyond physical placement. In this setup, the man remains seated on a stable chair or firm surface. His posture is grounded, still, consistent. The woman is positioned on top, facing him, with full contact between their bodies. At first glance, many people assume this is about control or performance. But that is not the core of it. The core is balance between stability and expression, because the man is not moving much here. He is not leading through motion. Instead, he becomes the structural foundation, the anchor, and that role is often underestimated. From a psychological standpoint, stillness is not absence, it is support. And when one person provides a stable base, the other gains freedom of movement. That is exactly what happens here. The woman is able to move naturally, adjust rhythm, and explore comfort without worrying about imbalance. And that changes her entire emotional experience, because now movement is not stressful. It is expressive. She is not holding herself up while also trying to maintain connection. She is supported while expressing herself. That distinction matters more than it appears on the surface. Now, from the man's perspective, this position requires a different kind of engagement. Not physical dominance, not constant motion, but awareness. He becomes the observer as much as the participant. He sees her fully, her expression, her reactions, her emotional shifts, and that visibility creates a very direct form of connection. Because when someone is fully visible and not distracted, the interaction becomes more emotionally transparent. There is less guessing, less misinterpretation, more immediate feedback. At the same time, eye contact becomes a major component here, not fleeting, but sustained. And sustained eye contact in intimate contexts has a very strong psychological effect. It removes distance. It increases emotional awareness. It makes the interaction feel more personal than mechanical. For many women, this is where the experience becomes meaningful beyond the physical aspect. Because she is not just moving, she is being seen while moving, and that creates a sense of validation. Not validation in a superficial sense, but in a deeply human sense of acknowledgement. Now, there is another important layer here. This position often allows the woman to take initiative in rhythm and control of movement. But unlike situations where control feels isolating, here it is shared. Because the man is still fully engaged, fully present, providing structure through his posture and attention. So the responsibility is not one-sided, it becomes collaborative. He is the foundation, she is the motion. And together, they create a rhythm that is not forced but naturally synchronized. This is one of the key reasons why many women gravitate toward this dynamic, without always being able to explain it logically. It combines freedom with support, expression with stability, movement with grounding. Now we move into a transition toward a much more emotionally intense concept: surrender in physical form. This is where positions like legs on shoulders take on their deeper psychological meaning. Because at this stage, it is no longer just about interaction, it is about exposure and trust. In this position, the woman lies on her back while her legs are lifted and supported. Her body is open completely, not in a forced way, but in a guided and supported way. And that distinction is crucial because guided vulnerability feels safe. Unstructured vulnerability does not. Here, the man's role becomes very precise. He supports her legs, maintains positioning, adjusts pressure and alignment naturally. But more importantly, he maintains emotional consistency through his presence. Because in a fully open position, emotional steadiness becomes as important as physical stability. The woman is exposed, fully visible, without protective posture. And that requires trust in real time. Not theoretical trust, but active trust being reinforced moment by moment through eye contact, through responsiveness, through attentiveness to her reactions. This is where many people misunderstand the dynamic. They focus on intensity. But the real foundation is reassurance. The reassurance that vulnerability is safe here, that exposure is not dangerous, that openness will not be met with detachment. And when that reassurance is present, the experience becomes emotionally grounded rather than overwhelming. Now, there is another layer to this position that is often overlooked: the proximity of faces. Because the angle naturally brings both individuals into a close visual field, there is minimal distance, minimal distraction, just direct presence. And that presence intensifies emotional perception significantly, not because of physical intensity alone, but because of attention combined with exposure. When a woman is fully open in this way and still being fully seen, it creates a psychological state of trust reinforcement. She is not being avoided. She is not being detached from. She is being held in awareness. And that is where we will continue in the final part, where the most direct expression of surrender, devotion, and emotional reciprocity is explored in its clearest psychological form. Now we reach the final layer of this entire discussion, where everything comes together into its most direct psychological form. This is the seated oral position dynamic, often reduced to a physical description, but in reality, it carries one of the strongest emotional contrasts in the entire breakdown of intimacy. The structure is simple. The woman sits on the edge of a bed or on a stable surface. She leans back slightly relaxed and supported. The man is positioned in front of her, lower in height, fully focused on her. And this difference in level is where the psychology begins, because he is not standing, he is not elevated. He is grounded below her, and that changes perception immediately. Now, many people instinctively misunderstand this kind of positioning. They interpret it through the lens of dominance or submission in a rigid way. But the reality is far more nuanced, because this is not about lowering value. It is about redirecting attention completely. The man is not distracted by movement or posture. He is focused entirely on her experience. And that level of focus creates something very specific: undivided attention. For the woman, this creates a very distinct emotional response. She is not adjusting constantly. She is not performing in multiple directions. She is not managing the interaction from every angle. Instead, she is in a receiving state, relaxed, supported, present. And that state is often underestimated in discussions about intimacy, because receiving without effort is rare in most human interactions. We are usually required to respond, adjust, or perform in some way. But here, that expectation is reduced significantly. Now, from a psychological standpoint, what happens next is very important. She becomes the center of attention without interruption, not partially, not occasionally, but completely. And that creates a sense of being prioritized that goes beyond physical interaction. It becomes emotional recognition. Now, from his perspective, this position requires a very specific kind of discipline: not physical dominance, not control through movement, but sustained focus. Because kneeling or lowering posture is not just a physical adjustment, it is a mental shift. It removes distractions, it removes ego positioning, it removes competing priorities, and replaces them with one clear focus: her experience. That shift is what many people miss, because the true effort here is not strength, it is attention. And attention, when sustained, becomes a form of emotional communication. It says without words, I am here, I am with you. I am not leaving this moment mentally. For many women, that is the core emotional value of this dynamic: not intensity, not complexity, but presence that does not break. Now, there is also a visual layer that cannot be ignored because she can see him clearly, fully engaged, fully focused. And that creates a feedback loop of emotional awareness. She feels seen. He shows attention. That attention reinforces her sense of being valued, and that cycle continues naturally. Now we reach the final psychological idea in this entire series: surrender with safety. Because in all the positions discussed so far, there is a repeating pattern. Vulnerability only becomes meaningful when it is met with stability. Exposure only becomes comfortable when it is met with presence. And surrender only becomes positive when it is met with emotional reassurance. That is the foundation underneath everything described in this entire breakdown: not technique, not complexity, not performance, but emotional reliability. Now, when you step back and look at all of this together, a clear pattern emerges. Women are not simply asking for more intensity, they are asking for more presence, more stillness, more attention, more emotional safety expressed through physical connection. And when that is present, the physical form becomes secondary, because what remains is connection: real, grounded, and mutual awareness between two people. That is the real message behind everything discussed here, not positions themselves, but what they represent emotionally when done with genuine attention and care. And that is where this entire breakdown ends.